And so here come these animals in front of Adam, and Adam is supposed to name them, categorize them. And as he sees the platypus and the whatever come in front of him, the giraffe, he is essentially thinking in his head, not like me, not like me, not like me, not according to my kind. And then when the woman is created, what are the first words out of his mouth? Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She should be called like me because she came from me. He says, same of my same.
Today on the show, we have Jen Wilkin, who is a gifted author and speaker, a trusted voice on the subject of women and their roles in ministry, which is a hot topic, which we're going to tackle today. The topic's important to us for many reasons. Lifeway is one of the top producers in the world of women's ministry resources and women voices and speakers and authors. So it's a conversation we're obviously a part of, but it's important to us also, Lindley, just personally.
Well, personally, I mean, for me, for Ava, I think we get a lot of feedback from people just because of your role of just they're hurt. We just wanted to have the conversation with Jen about her perspective.
And we're still processing it as well. I mean, you were on staff as a woman of a staff that was largely male. These conversations about what is it like to be a woman in the room when most of the people around the table are male, maybe all of the people are male. Mm-hmm. In fact, we get to rub shoulders with church leaders all the time. And I had a strong woman say to me recently that she's the only person on staff that's a female. And it's just very difficult because at the end of the meeting, when they start distributing tasks, she gets assigned the menial ones. Mm-hmm. Like, would you take care of that? Would you take care of that? And she has the highest respect for her brothers in the room, but she doesn't think they realize how that comes across. Well, let me just put it this way. They ask her to do the things they don't want to do.
Well, I mean, it's just the things that are gender kind of stereotypical, like, oh, can you make coffee before the next meeting? Could you run by the store to get something? Could you make a copy of something? I mean, and so it's just a little bit of a stereotype, you know, the man is the leader, the woman is the secretary.
So today's conversation is going to be, I think, so helpful because Jen is amazing at talking about this in terms of what is it like to be a woman on a church staff, or how can a church clarify its position on the role of women in ministry and even titles they've decided to use.
I liked when she talked about the family of God. We're brothers and sisters. I feel like we need to get to a place to where we feel more like brothers and sisters.
And she talks about the vulnerability of being a female and how that dominates a lot of your thinking when you enter into a room or a dark alley. Mm-hmm. Men and women think differently, and that definitely affects the dynamics on a team.
Well, funny story about that, and we can cut this out, but even last night, I was taking our 3 teenage boys to a UT basketball game, and Ben was not able to go. He had a speaking thing, and we parked. We're in a parking garage, and the boys are just walking along happily, and I'm just looking around constantly like, what's happening? Who's around us? What's the context of where I am? Right. And they look at me like, why are you stressed? Like, what? Just keep walking. Like, there's nothing wrong. And they don't even understand it because they're just young men.
And I've noticed that when we travel, you often feel very vulnerable or insecure about being, walking from one place to the next because you're a female.
Uber. Some of those things.
And so she does an amazing job of talking about this. I was blown away by how articulate she was. She's clearly thought a lot on this subject. So I think you're going to enjoy this. Lindley, today we are recording from our kitchen.
Yep.
Lifeway is about to open a new teaming space, and so we are winging it for a couple of months on the podcast. So we have today one of Lifeway's favorite people and top authors, Jen Wilkin, on the show. Jen, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
We are so excited to have you. How is it down there in Texas?
It's a little chilly for my taste, but I'm holding it together.
What's the temperature? What's chilly for your taste?
It's in the upper 30s right now.
Oh, okay.
But it'll get better later this afternoon. I'm just going to hide in my house until such time as my extremities can deal.
So, Jen, you're going to warm up quickly because this is a hot topic we've got today. As we know, all over the kingdom, there is great debate on what a woman can and can't do in the church. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's caused enormous division and polarization, and it's been a heartache for me as leader of Lifeway. I know for Lindley and her role. We have a daughter who loves public speaking, who loves to teach, who's asking all these questions about where do I fit in the future of the church, or should I seek to take my gifts elsewhere. So we have heard you speak about this. We love the way you talk about it and the tone in which you speak of it. So thanks for talking to us about women in ministry and where this conversation is going. So I heard you talk about this on a reel. You were talking about how the dominant metaphor of the church is a woman, is a bride.
Yeah.
A theological connection there. Like, talk about that talk and even what you heard, what feedback you got about that.
Well, I was basically making the point that if we're going to understand the mission of the church, we need to have an understanding of the female perspective. And what I mean by that is the embodied female perspective, because when we talk about differences between men and women, one of the key things that we should recognize, and I think most people can recognize because it's evident in our physicality, is that men enjoy physical dominance that women don't enjoy in adulthood, and so that shapes the way that we experience the world. It means that women, when we grow to adulthood, don't outgrow our awareness of vulnerability. So probably the easiest way to understand this in simple terms is if I were to ask you, Ben, when you're walking down a dark alley, what are you thinking about? You would probably say things like my husband says. He said that when I asked him that question, he said, where's my car?
Yeah.
Or, what time do I have to get up in the morning? But if I ask Lindley the same question, she's going to probably say, I'm hypervigilant. I've got my phone out pretending to talk on it. I'm scanning all around me. I've got my keys between my knuckles because someone told me I could use them like brass knuckles if someone attacked me. And so we just know, even into adulthood, that we still have physical vulnerability. And that's not, it means that when we sociologically look at the impact on women as a result of that we do tend to have a more top of mind awareness of vulnerability in general.
Interesting.
And it means that you think about the way that even men tend to make decisions. They tend to be more straight line in their decision making. They tend to be more independent in the way that they think about things. Women tend to think more collectively. They tend to think more collaboratively. I'm ripping all of this off from sociology. Like you can find an article on this on Psychology Today. But also I think we see this just in our everyday lives. I see it in having led teams of women for years, that a decision needs to be made when everybody's on board. And then when I sit in a room with that's predominantly men, I see how decisions are made a little differently. It's not wrong. They're two different ways of encountering the world that are probably related to our biology.
Which makes it really hard, I'm sure, to empathize between the genders in terms of to truly understand what it feels like to be a woman is nearly impossible for a man.
I think it can be, but I think that's another barrier that we run into in the church because what the culture will either say that there are no differences between men and women, or they will say that men and women are mutually exclusive categories. And I think that because the loudest voice in the culture in the last 20 years has been there are no distinctions between men and women, the church actually doubled down on the message of men are from Mars, women are from Venus, which is not what the Bible shows us. The Bible actually shows us in Genesis chapter 2 that we're created by the same God in the same image, in the same garden, charged with the same cultural mandate. And then we understand distinction as it relates to our shared sameness.
You were saying that in the past 20 years, you feel like the churches have doubled down on this a little bit. Have you done some research on that? Because I do just think back, and I think of my experience growing up in the church, the Baptist church especially. I don't really recall hearing much about this this just ongoing debate about men and women, and I feel like it's just kind of a newer thing. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's always been there, but it took on heightened importance in people's minds as we saw a culture shift around gender identity. And that's understandable. But what has made me sad in that is that we have a tendency to overcorrect. Like when a pendulum swings one direction, it very rarely hits back toward a moderate place after it has swung. And so the church, because we're afraid of absorbing a cultural message, we actually have absorbed a cultural message that was from the previous time period. I mean, you think about the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. It was a bestseller for a long, long time. And it was the idea that, like, gosh, we're just so different. How could we possibly understand each other? And think about how that formed the basis for even like sitcoms and romantic comedies, right? That we were these mutually exclusive categories. And now what you see is you've got the female superhero who can do every single thing that the male superhero can do. And so what concerns me is that I think sometimes in the church, because we want to reject interchangeable roles for men and women, we've run toward another vision of manhood and womanhood that denies what we share in common. And so it's important, we talk about the way that the Bible introduces ideas being significant. Like, where does it start with an idea? And when the woman is formed in Genesis chapter 2, before she is formed out of Adam's side, God says it's not good for the man to be alone. And so you would expect that the next thing that happens is that he creates the woman. But that's not what happens. There's a parade of animals that comes in front of Adam. We've just had the rhythm of Genesis chapter 1 of saying that God has created the animals each according to its kind. And so here come these animals in front of Adam, and Adam is supposed to name them, categorize them. And as he sees the platypus and the whatever come in front of him, the giraffe, he is essentially thinking in his head, not like me, not like me, not like me, not according to my kind. And then when the woman is created, what are the first words out of his mouth? Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She should be called like me because she came from me. He says same of my same. And so when we look at the way that men and women, the conversation has gone in the church, we've actually, I would say, taken a step back toward objectifying each other. Because we've placed such an emphasis on distinction at the expense of sameness. And sameness is what helps us hold mutual respect and regard for each other. So when it drops out of the conversation, it means all we're left with is, you're so different. And that either turns into you're less than me or you're incomprehensible to me.
So let's get into the feelings of this a little bit, because there's been a lot of emotion around the subject and a lot of hurt. I've been in rooms packed full of people with others coming to microphones and speaking out on this topic, and the way we talk about it matters. And so for those out there who are trying to get their mind around, like, what is the cause of so much emotion that women are feeling right now? Could you maybe just summarize, like, where do you feel like the hurt is right now with women in this conversation, and how could we steward it better?
Well, I certainly can never speak for all women on this, but I can speak a little from my own personal experience. I was raised in a home by a father who loved me and told me that I had gifts and that they should find a place to be expressed. I married a man who saw my gifts and said, these are gifts and they should be expressed. I had 4 brothers who celebrated me. All of my relationships with men were positive and life affirming. And the first place that changed for me was in my local church.
Wow.
And I think that there are other women who've had a similar experience. Why do people see something in me outside of the church, but inside of the church, I'm either supposed to conceal that or not put that into practice? And then, unfortunately, what has happened is the conversation has become polarized around who gets to preach.
Right.
And that's a big frustration point for me. So, cards on the table in my church, women don't preach on Sundays. And contrary to what the internet may tell you, I have never preached at the Village Church. I mean, that's not our position on the role of women. But personally, for me, autobiographically, I don't feel like anybody took anything from me. That's not the flashpoint for me. I think that the office of preaching is important, but I don't think it's everything. I feel like the work that I have to do is good and meaningful in the spaces that I'm doing it. And so when I'm told, well, you just want the pulpit, I'm like, why do you think the pulpit is the ultimate goal for anyone in ministry? Like, frankly, it's not the goal for most of us, right? And take women out of the equation. The vast majority of men in the church are never going to be in the pulpit, but nobody thinks they're angling for that space, And so why are women suspect? So that's a big question that we should ask and answer. And I do think that there are underlying narratives in the minds of some men in leadership, based on what I would say is a warped reading of Genesis chapter 3, that women want to take power from men. that we want to usurp. That is our defining characteristic on the other side of the fall.
Jen, this is a story from Scripture that continues to convict me too. It's the story of Esther, where the king is humiliated by the queen, and he wants to put her away. And his male friends come up and say, "Hey, you need to issue an edict right now throughout the whole land to let people know that women cannot do this to a powerful man." And this is a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And you see there, like, this fear of a woman humiliating a man becomes really the impetus for like this crazy decision he makes. As a man in the church, like, I have to look at that passage and ask myself the question, like, where am I intimidated by a strong woman who will stand up to me? Do I allow a woman to have a strong rebuke voice in my life that's on a leadership team? And I think this is a question that I'm concerned about. Is I have actually less interest in the pulpit conversation as well, and more interest in high capacity women making key decisions in the church. So how do we create a structure, knowing that the office of elder is reserved for men? We're not arguing that today. But there are so many unbelievably talented, decision-making, strategic women in the church that just don't feel like they have a place at the table. So how do we raise women up as leaders, not just preachers? Because that's a side discussion that I think polarizes us quickly.
Well, so first of all, a church would have to move past any baggage it has around the idea that leadership is masculine and submission is feminine.
Interesting.
I was about to say, even the way you worded that, Ben, a little bit, is how do we raise women up to be leaders? I think we have. How do we get that voice out there? I mean, that's my question, is how do we raise men up to be accepting of women leaders? Like, we can edit that out, of course.
Well, no, you don't have to edit that out, because what Jen just said is so true. I think there is a general understanding in many churches that masculine people are leaders and feminine people are followers.
Well, even among female leaders, if you have a more masculine communication style, you're more likely to experience success or openness to your ideas than if your communication style is overtly feminine.
Interesting.
Explain that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've picked up on this in communications with me, but I have a fairly male communication style. I'm direct. I'm not particularly story driven in the way that I tell. I did just share some story just now on this particular topic, but if you listen to my Bible teachings in my studies, I don't typically lead with personal story, which is a fairly feminine approach to communication. And so I've often wondered if the Lord gave me so many positive relationships with men in my family so that I could be almost like a translator in the ministry space to carry the needs and the voice of women into rooms that have been predominantly or all male in my experience of leadership in the church. But the leadership question, is one that I think every church has to answer on its own. A problem in this conversation is that many churches have not done the work themselves. They have dragged and dropped someone else's articulated position on what the Bible says on these things. And my own church went through a 2.5-year process of working out our own convictions on this issue. 2.5 years. And it was brutal. And what we learned in the process was a litmus test for us, or a red flag for us, that someone has actually not done their own work on this, is if they make this statement about the men and women conversation. Scripture is clear that fill in the blank. Because what we found now, that's not to say there's nothing that's clear in this conversation, but what we found is that the closer we got to the exegetical work, the harder it got, not the easier it got, which is why this conversation has been on the table for as long as it has been, and why it probably will be. And we learned that what we were up against was needing to land convictionally for our congregation. And so part of what's difficult about this conversation right now is you have people who want everyone in every church to land in one particular space. And if you don't land in that particular space, then you may not be a Christian. Like, that's the way this conversation has gone. And so I would just encourage those who are in the local church to have the courage of their own convictions and to land somewhere. You mentioned slippery slope, Ben, and that has been a word that has followed us around in this conversation, particularly at my own church, that if I land further one direction than you do, then I'm on a slippery slope toward, either patriarchy or third wave feminism. But we know that's not necessarily true. You're not always on a slippery slope. Sometimes you've taken a measured position and landed there, and you're committed to staying there.
That's really well said, Jen. You're so articulate. I want to say something funny about what you said earlier. Often when Lindley and I go out with a couple, we leave and she says, I'm like the dude and you're like the woman. What is up with this?
I said, I'm always like the guy. Like, why am I always like the guy?
You felt guilty about that. Like you tend to lean toward the masculine side.
Well, I think that's just a thing I've processed with being in ministry and being Ben's wife for all these years, is that there is this unwritten expectation that I should be XYZ. And I don't even know what XYZ is. I mean, that's what's been so interesting doing the Glass House, is that every pastor's wife we've talked to, they don't even know what their role is, but there's kind of this written role that the pastor's wife should be feminine, kind, soft-spoken, gracious, all those things. And I feel like I'm not. But then that's what's also been fun about the Glass House, is the amount of feedback we get of like, thank you for portraying a more masculine style of communication, kind of like what you were talking about, Jen.
Jen, did you watch Downton Abbey?
Oh yeah.
You remember the grandmother who always says the thing that makes the room light up?
Yeah.
That's Lindley. She has a way of like...
She's really grumpy.
But she makes the room so much more fun. Like, she actually says the thing that everybody else is thinking.
Yeah.
And so Lindley has a challenger mindset, and so she likes to say something challenging.
So does Jen.
Yes. And I personally, that's what drew me to Lindley. I like that kind of confrontational. It makes life interesting. But a woman who is bent to challenge or to push or to question, I fear sometimes in the church is labeled as somebody who's just a problem. And how do we get her off the team or off the committee? How have you experienced that? Or what would you say to a woman out there who feels that way?
Well, I mean, sometimes there are women who are, they just want to bust something up. But honestly, sometimes there are men who are like that too. And they don't always get the same read on their character that the woman does. And so I think a big component of this conversation is how leadership teams in churches think about the input of women. Because first of all, I want to say that even valuing the input of women in the local church for my own church, and I suspect for other churches as well, was not a product of wanting to empower women or let women self-actualize or the most common accusation, capitulate to culture, because, the culture is saying that women should be in every space. It was intensely pastoral for us. It was because we had harmed women by not having female voices in our rooms. So this conversation is never about promoting the voices of women so much as it is about protecting the vulnerable, which brings us back to where we open this conversation. Often it is the voices of women and the lived experiences of women which will raise a hand and say, I think we might be doing this wrong. So we saw this play out at my own church in the way that we were counseling women who we thought were in troubled marriages, and they were actually in abusive marriages. And this was before the Me Too movement. It was before anybody else was talking about it. We had some things we had to own in a very public and painful way. And this question became top of mind for us. We understood that when rooms are all male or predominantly male, the likelihood that women and sometimes children were not going to be treated as image bearers as we would want them to be was increased, and we didn't want that. So then the question is, I need to get women into decision making or counseling, where we're receiving women into pastoral care situations. But then who do I put in that room? And for the average man in ministry, they don't have a lot of relationship with women who aren't their wives, because that's supposed to be dangerous, right? So, but the thing is like we give responsibility or trust to people that we actually know, like that we know things about. And so then their default is, well, if I need to get a woman in the room, I'm going to get my trusted male friends wife in the room. So let's say typically it's let's get the elders' wives involved in the process. And some elders' wives are appropriate for that process, but generally speaking, those voices are the voices of your friends' wives or significant female people in their lives they're not disruptive voices. They are voices that are going to affirm and are going to support the decision that you've already made or the way that you're already leaning. And so one of the things that I'm most grateful for in my own church is that they knew I was not that. I'm not married to a person who is in a position of authority at the village church. My husband serves in children's ministry, and he's happy to do that until Jesus returns. And they invited me into the room anyway, because they knew that they needed someone who was going to say, hey, you can't do this. Or, hey, this is the positive thing that you should do. So, and not just me. There are other women besides me who've been invited into that space, who are willing to speak up when they disagree, or are willing to drive a process if it needs to be driven by a different voice.
Very well said. Can we talk about the cultural impact of women in ministry? When Lindley and I were church planters in Denver, there was literally no stigma about a woman being in any room. Mm-hmm. Like, it was just, why would they not be in the room? And so anytime Lindley came into a meeting, or anytime she was a part of a conversation involving direction, it was just assumed that that's normal and natural. Coming back to the South has been, wow. Like, the way we've had to so delicately deal with this issue, being back in Tennessee, has been a little overwhelming at times in terms of the sensitivities to a woman's voice being brought into a room.
Mm-hmm. Do you think because Nashville is a melting pot. I almost wonder if it's not just your role in leadership. It's just a higher people in Colorado didn't really know what we were. People in the South didn't know what we were doing in Colorado. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I do think the patriarchal nature of the South certainly has colored the way we think about having women in the room. And yet, like at Lifeway, so we have 6 executive leaders, and 3 are men and 3 are women, and they're all equally strong. And it has brought so much diversity and fun to the meetings since we've balanced that. And recently, we have an African-American female on our executive leadership team. We actually have 2. One of them was sharing with us a vulnerability. And she said that she always feels like her presentations and meetings have to be A+ presentations because she's a minority female. She's felt this pressure, like she always has to be on top of her game because she's representative and needs to do a really good job with this unique opportunity God's given her. So one of the things I'm beginning to grow sensitive to is just how much pressure it can be.
Yep.
To be either the only woman in the room or maybe one of 2 with 8 other guys in the room. How do we deal with that? Or what advice would you give to a pastor who has a staff that way?
Well, I do think it is important to recognize the weight that the first female in the room is going to carry, and if at all like when my church said, "Will you serve on the executive staff?" I said, "I will, but you can't put me in there alone. I need another female in the room," because there's just a tendency over time, even because the trust level is high, there's a high trust level with me in that room, but it can turn into, well, that's just how she is, instead of, we could do that with anybody in the room, right? But if you're looking specifically for a female influence to be felt in decision making, then it can't just be coming from one female in the room long term. You've got to have more than one voice, or the tendency will be to think about that as that's just Jen's input. Secondly, you don't want to just, again, put any woman in the room. You want to put a qualified woman in the room. And I think one of the things that's been missing in this conversation is we have a clear idea of what a qualified man is when we talk about eldership. But we wanted to have also a sense of a qualified woman. I'm not an elder at the village church, but one of the things that I have tried to say is I want to meet every requirement of an elder except one. Because if I can embody that, then you can't know that doesn't exist anymore. And I also want to show you how it is helpful. And so here is here is what I would encourage church leaders to think about. We opened this episode with the metaphor of the church as female. But I want to give the metaphor that guided our own church as we were trying to write a paper on women in ministry. And we asked, what's the overarching metaphor for the church all the way from Genesis to Revelation? And what we saw was that the church as a bride is a metaphor, but it is not the overarching metaphor. The overarching metaphor we found was when Jesus has his mother and brothers come to him and say, hey, we're outside, we want to talk to you. And he turns and he looks at a room full of people and he says, who are my mother and brothers and sisters? Anyone who does the will of the Father. So then you see throughout the New Testament that word adelphoi, brothers and sisters, brothers and sisters, brothers and sisters. The overarching metaphor for the church is the family of God. So then look at the way that the typical theologically conservative church operates in the way that it has leadership and the way that it functions. And what we see in many cases is a family that has an authoritarian father who makes the rules, children who toe the line, and an absentee mother. If you had a family in your church that fit that description, you would feel concern for the well-being of those children, and you would be wondering where the mom went. And I think when we look at the church today, we see that some. What do we see? We see an exodus of women from theologically conservative spaces because they can't see where they're supposed to serve. Not only that, when you have a motherless church, a church that has no visible spiritual mothers in it, women don't stop looking for someone who will be a spiritual mother to them. They look outside of the church to find it. And so some of them are looking at me because my head's on a screen in their Bible study. And I always like to say, hey, there is an aspect of spiritual mothering that I can do remotely, but I am not there to answer your question when you're in crisis. I am not there for you to come to in your moment of need. I am not there to have theological discourse with you or to tell you how you can function better in your place of work or in your relationship with your aging parents. We need visible mothers in the church in the same way that you want a visible and active mother in the home. Not only that, but in a healthy, functioning home, you don't see dad go into the bedroom, shut the door, think thoughts about what should happen for the family, and come out and announce it to the rest of the family. And so why would we assume that that's a healthy model for the local church? So we thought hard on these things, and then we went back to the scriptures that are typically pulled out from their context and given to us as scripture is clear that. And we started asking questions about how the church could function truly as the family of God.
Churches more and more are trying to show equality toward women, and some have begun to assign the word pastor to kids pastor or student pastor, and it's a woman. Because language is fluid and because things are always changing with the way we call stuff. How are you feeling about that conversation, or where have you encouraged people to look or think in that direction?
Well, I can't speak for all churches. I think that churches have to do the work themselves. Right. I do tend to think that a lot of this is just semantics, right? That churches that have less of a clear definition for pastor are more likely to use it in a multi-purpose tool way. So I don't want to assign motive where there's no motive, right? And right. I think what can happen is that people are like, oh, they said pastor, they're libs. And maybe what they were doing is recognizing that a role had a pastoral element to it, but didn't require to be filled by a pastor elder. And so they gave it that title. I would actually urge churches to have clarity of terminology. I just think it's helpful for everyone. And that's something that we landed on at my own church, and I'm very grateful for. It doesn't save me a beating in all circumstances, because at one point my title was minister, and every Presbyterian in the country had an apoplectic fit and thought that I was preaching on Sundays. And I was like, I'm just not, guys. Like, minister is a title that our church uses to describe a particular aspect of my role. And then my title was changed to director in my next role, and everybody got a lot quieter. That just didn't trigger anything. And so, but again, you're not going to please everyone, right? People are going to take a shot at you for wherever you land. And so the important thing is to land and be clear in your own church, because the more vague, clarity is kindness. And so the more vague you've been, the more you've been like, well, we're just going to do it this way. Or my personal favorite, we're just going to err on the side of caution.
It would almost be better if once in a while someone from the church just said, hey, here are all the different titles we use in the church, and let me tell you what we mean by them. Mm-hmm. And this is how we've decided as the leadership of this church to use these terms, and here's the biblical defense on why. Mm-hmm. And what everybody else thinks on Twitter doesn't matter to us.
That's right.
We don't.
But also, like, if you think about it, the title of pastor has been handed out almost like an honorary degree sometimes to men. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the title of pastor is now being given sometimes to women, because when you weren't really sure of your why when you were giving that title out in the first place, then it does get foggy over time. And so you got to know your why. You got to have a clear definition. You got to use the title consistently. And it's a help to everyone.
Yeah, I sure hope as we head into the convention next summer that, the fluidity of the Baptist faith and message is that every local church is responsible for, like you just said, clarifying what they're going to do on this issue. And there's just no way for every church to agree. It's not going to happen. So we have to give the freedom to the Holy Spirit and to the leaders in the church to gather and make clarity. Because I do like what you said, clarity is kindness for your church.
Jen, last year we went back to Storyline to our church, and it was the 7th birthday, and Ben and I got to get up there and speak a little bit, and we let our children choose if they wanted to speak, and so Ava did. She did a great job. People were so complimentary of her, but I noticed that there was a man who said, "It's too bad you're not a boy, because you would have been a great preacher." And it was just a little bit hard for her to receive that, because here she is feeling like affirmed in this gift that she had up there. And I was really surprised by it. It was the first time I thought, wow, she really doesn't get nervous up there. She has recall like her dad. I don't have that. And so she just felt discouraged. I mean, what would be some advice you would give to the young girls out there who, like, what path can they move forward within their own church? Who do they talk to? I mean, that whole process.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it really depends heavily on what church you're in, doesn't it? I would be looking for a church where the men who are in leadership understand the beauty of male-female partnership in the mission of God. I do think that the example you've given illustrates another semantic problem that we have. Not only do we need a clear definition for pastor, we need a clear definition for preaching. And again, that's in your own local church based on your own convictions of how you understand the topic. So I can't mandate that for other churches, but I can tell you that it's been a huge help to me when my own church clarified a definition that preaching is done by a particular person in a particular context. It's done by the pastor elder in the gathering, which means that when I stand, it's not based on my tone of voice, my ability to communicate, the content, if I'm teaching a passage or not. It's done by a particular person in a particular context. I don't have elder authority. I'm not an elder. I'm not going to, place you under church discipline or whatever if you don't respond to my exhortation. Now, I teach under the authority of my elders, and so I have a delegated authority from them to stand up and teach the Bible in our women's Bible study space or wherever else I'm teaching in the church. But so you want a church that has done the hard work of asking these questions so that the language that they're pointing toward women is not prohibitive, it's invitational. And I think that's another thing that emerges in all of this is if the language is women are permitted to do X, Y, and Z, well, that's kind of a red flag to me because we don't say, and non-elder men are also permitted to do X, Y, and Z. Like, it's like, hey, man, I really want you to get involved in this. You'd be amazing. Well, where's that language directed toward women, right? That's what you're looking for is someone who's eager for partnership, who understands that the absence of female input or the absence of female voices means that their church is functionally motherless, and that's a red flag. So I do think one does not stop developing one's evident gifts just because there might be a blind spot in the church. So we continue to develop our gifts and we look for the Lord to give places for us to use them. Because here's what I wish that everyone in the church could understand. God does not give a gift to any of us that is not needful. And so he's not like just throwing out gifts and hoping, or like, use it or don't use it or whatever. Like, we are given gifts for the forwarding of the Great Commission. And so if your local church becomes a place where you're not able to use them, the Lord will give you a place to use them because they're essential and indispensable. They're not nice, but not necessary. I do think it's revealing within the SBC the enormous number of women who go into foreign missions. I hope that that's not a symptom that it is easier to use your gifts overseas than it is in the local church. But I think that it could be an indicator. I also look around at the number of women who end up in parachurch organizations in leadership, and I hope that that is not a symptom, that it is easier or it is their only option to exist outside of the church than to exist inside of the church.
So I'm guessing as we think about practical steps, there's a pastor out there, maybe a pastor and pastor's wife listening to this episode, and they're thinking, how do we take some steps forward with our church in clarifying our position? I'm guessing your first recommendation would be to gather a group of thinkers and start talking about how we're going to land on this, right?
Well, again, it has to be pastoral. It has to hurt a little. If it's just a theological exercise, I don't think the motivation is there to actually do the work that it requires. One of the first steps that we took in my own church was the two women who were part of our team of working on this idea asked to be able to take anonymous feedback from women who were on our staff and see what their experience was of being a woman on staff in our church. We sat down in a room and basically took dictation, and we were able to group those stories into some fairly predictable categories. Things like I overheard my supervisor saying that I was too pretty for him to work with, or I was told that if I drove the minivan to church that I was unsubmissive, or he CCs his wife, or he CCs his wife on all of our communications. It was those kinds of things, but these are things that a lot of times have been communicated even at the seminary level as that's how you should think about things. And so when we took those into our elder room, it broke their hearts. And here's a really important part in this story for me. There are no villains in my story. Like, I wouldn't look to any of the men who I've been in conversation around this with and say, he woke up in the morning asking how he could exclude or ignore. Yeah. It's just, that's you don't know what you don't know. And so I think if you're, and most churches that I talk to about this, they say, well, that was a problem at your church. It's not a problem at our church, which just tells me that you may not have the channels open to hear where the problems are. Because even, let's talk about the abuse question. Obviously, abuse is everywhere. It's no respecter of theological position. Perpetrators know how to camouflage themselves in any environment, whether you're an egalitarian or a complementarian. So we need to be sure that we have every tool available to us to make sure that our church, my local church, as far as possible with me, is a safe place for everybody who's there, and that the necessary voices to ensure that that is true are in the rooms that they need to be in. So you got to start by doing an honest assessment of how your church is doing with regard to pastoral care issues, and with the lived experience of the women who are in your existing leadership spaces, and then sitting in the seats in your congregation.
I have one more question about advice you give. I know you speak a lot. I'm certain that women come up afterwards and are very upset. They have stories of hurt of. You just don't understand my situation, and I have to be at this church, but they're not accepting of me. Like, what advice do you give, or do you just listen? I mean, do you just tell them, because everyone's situation is so different, do you just hear them out?
Well, I have some general advice that I can offer. Obviously, there's not enough time in a line like that to get to hear all of the why or the what behind a story, and I try to be really careful about offering counsel in that situation. But I think that based on our personalities, there are two ways that we respond to a perceived injustice. One is, I'm out of here. I'm going to fix this from the outside. And the other is, I'm going to stay and I'm going to try to fix it from the inside. Those who leave have a tendency to look at those who stay and call them enablers. Those who stay have a tendency to look at those who leave and call them quitters. I actually think that maybe what we should do is say, I can't discern for you what your role is in making this better, but I can discern my own role in it, and I can do my best to execute it. So I understand why women leave. I'm the one who reforms from the inside. That's the way the Lord built me. And it means that I do have to ask questions about, am I enabling something, or am I reforming something? And I think the person whose tendency is, I'm going to do this from the outside, has to ask, am I fleeing the scene, or do I truly believe I can have more of an impact on this outside than inside? So that's some heart work, or some thought work that people can do, women can do, as they're facing a conversation about whether they should stay or go in their local church.
That's really helpful.
It's super helpful. And sometimes I've been guilty of saying, man, that person is a weak person for staying inside that system. They need to just get some strength and walk away, when sometimes the hardest thing in the world is staying and enduring and being patient, which I don't tend to have any of those fruits. So I have my own gifts. Well, Jen, it is an absolute honor and pleasure. Hey, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, have a good day.
The Glass House is a production of Lifeway. It's produced and edited by Angie Elkins. Sound engineering by Dale Sandberg. Original music by Robert Elkins. Photography by Rebecca McVeigh. And artwork by Heather Berzinski. We are your hosts, Ben and Lindley Mandrell. Thanks for listening.